there's a story that is recounted starting in chapter 32 and verse 24. Verse 24 says, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Now, right off, that's strange. He was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Who wrestles all night long? And who is this man? Where did he show up from? And when he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he touched the socket of his thigh. And we might think that Jacob was the one who wasn't succeeding here, but no, Jacob was winning the wrestling match. And the fellow he was wrestling with performs a miracle of some sort, so that the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated while he wrestled with him. But even at that, Jacob still seems to prevail. He says, not Jacob, but the fellow he's wrestling with says, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. But he said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. And we know, of course, this is a story of Jacob wrestling with the angel. You know, it's odd. Jacob not only wrestles with the angel, he wins. And even after the angel disarms him, as it were, dislegs him, I guess, dislocates his leg, he still wins. He's still got the angel pinned. And he insists not that the angel cry uncle, but that the angel pronounce a blessing on him. And the angel responds in verse 28, and he says, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, the name meaning deceiver, but Israel. Jacob wasn't going to practice any more deception. He'd learned his lesson about that. Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel. The name Israel is significant too. Israel is Hebrew, a word that means to strive with God. He says, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. And you see that meaning in the statement, even in the very thing that had been going on there that night. He'd been wrestling with none other than the angel of the Lord, as Jacob himself would acknowledge before this was all over. And it's in that context that he gets this name, by which we really know him better later on in the Old Testament. And even in the New Testament, the name Israel, strives with God. Not blessed by God, not favored of God, but strives with God. You know, that could be good or bad. And that's pretty much the way the history of his descendants would go. Sometimes good, sometimes bad. Striving with God, striving with man. Sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. And yet still in that striving, God was working out his purposes for his people. Jacob wrestled with the angel. Verse 30 says, Jacob named the place Peniel or Penuel, where he said, I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been preserved. Well, as we noted, he goes on back in. He's reconciled with his brother Esau, and it might look like things are going to go well for him finally. But his beloved wife, Rachel, dies giving birth to the 12th and last son, Benjamin. And, you know, it is amazing how sons can repeat the mistakes of their fathers, and I suppose daughters of their mothers too, for that matter. I want you to turn over now to Genesis chapter 37. You know, so many problems arose in that family, apparently as a result of Isaac favoring Esau and Rebekah favoring Jacob. You might think that Jacob would say, well, you know, I see what damage it created when my father wanted to play favorites and so forth, and loved Esau more than he loved me, so I'm going to try and treat all my sons the same. But he didn't do that. Rachel was his beloved wife, and he loved her two sons more than the others, those two sons being Joseph and Benjamin, and Joseph because he was the firstborn of those two. And over in Genesis chapter 37, we come to what we might think of as the beginning of the story of Joseph. Indeed, it is that. But really, it's also very much still the story of Jacob. And I want to look at it right now, thinking not so much of Joseph and what happens to him, but thinking rather of Jacob and what happens to him. In Genesis chapter 37, picking up about verse 3, it says, Now Israel loved Joseph more than all of his sons, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him this varicolored tunic, this multicolored garment. And all of the other brothers, the older brothers, became jealous because of that. It says in verse 4, they hated him, could not speak to him on friendly terms. To make it even worse, Joseph began to have these dreams. These dreams that, though they were symbolic, very clearly indicated that Joseph was having dreams indicating that somehow Joseph was going to be the leading brother and that everybody else was going to bow down to him. In fact, one of the dreams was that of the sun and the moon and 12 stars, and the sun and the moon and all of the other stars bowed down to Joseph's star. And so, verse 11, his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept these things in his mind. Well, you know the story. On one occasion, the brothers were all out taking care of the sheep, and Jacob sent Joseph out to see how they were doing. And he goes and he locates them. And in verse 18 it says, when they saw him from a distance, and before he came close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. And they said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Now then, come, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we will say a wild beast devoured him. Then let us see what will become of his dreams. And you talk about a strange twist, of course, is precisely in what they're planning to do to Joseph, that those dreams will be set in motion to be fulfilled. But not focusing on that right now. We're told in verse 21, Reuben heard this, rescued him out of their hands, and said, let's not take his life. Reuben further said to them, shed no blood, throw him into this pit that is in the wilderness, but do not lay hands on him, that he might rescue him out of their hands to restore him to his father. So it came about when Joseph reached his brothers that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the vari-colored tunic that was on him. And they took him and threw him into the pit, and the pit was empty, it didn't have any water in it. And they sat down to eat a meal. And they raised their eyes and looked, and behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead. And so they say, look, why kill our brother? Let's sell him. We'll get rid of him just as well, and we won't have his blood on our hands. And so they do. They sell him. They brought him out of the pit, sold him to the Ishmaelites, the caravan of Ishmaelites and Midianites, for 20 shekels of silver. Verse 29, Reuben came back. He didn't realize what was going on. He had been planning to kind of rescue Joseph here, but it's too late. A lot of times in life we miss our opportunity to do good. He missed his opportunity. And so he said, where is he? And they, says, what are we going to do? He says, where am I to go? He's the oldest brother. He's apparently, saying, Dad is going to be upset. He's going to ask me. I'm going to have to give an account for what has taken place. So they hatch a plan. In verse 31, it says, they took Joseph's tunic and slaughtered a male goat and dipped the tunic in the blood. Then they sent the vari-colored tunic and brought it to their father and said, we found this. Please examine it to see whether it is your son's tunic or not. And he examined it, and he said, it is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. The son in whom he had invested so much of his love, so much of his devotion, is now in his mind and in his heart surely dead. Verse 34, he tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his loins, and mourned for his son many days. They tried to comfort him, and he refused to be comforted. He said in the verse 35, surely I will go down to Sheol in mourning for my son. He says, I will not be comforted. I am grief-stricken, and I'm going to stay that way till I die. So his father wept for him, and Joseph went off to Egypt. You realize what's happened. Here, it wasn't just that one time that sort of poetic justice was served, that Jacob was deceived in the same way that he had deceived. Back there, the swapping of sister for sister in some ways more nearly parallels, or reflects, what he had done in swapping brother for brother. But here he's being deceived again. And now he's learning what it's like for a father to be deceived. He's learning what it's like to be deceived by his own sons, to be deceived by sons that are trying to struggle for power within the family, even as had happened and as he had deceived his own father. And, a lot of times we can, with one sin, we can unleash a whole lot of things that even after we ourselves may long since have repented of the sin, there's still going to be consequences that plague us the rest of our lives sometimes. I mean, don't you know that was kind of part of the family lore about how Jacob had tricked Esau and gotten that? How are you going to raise good, honest sons when the defining moment in your life was how you deceived your father and got yourself put in place for your brother? In many ways, Jacob spent the rest of his life paying for that deceit, paying for it with deceit that was returned to him, not just by Laban in switching the daughters, but time and time again. Now he was deceived and disappointed, and now even by his sons, even as he had deceived his father. As I said, we're not going to focus on the story of Joseph. You know basically what took place. Joseph was sold off as a slave to Egypt, eventually rose to great power, and eventually his brothers had to go down there and get grain, and that led eventually to the family being saved and to the elevation of Joseph, just as God had said would be the case. I want you to turn over to Genesis chapter 45, where Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers on the occasion of their having come back down to Egypt once again to get grain. And of course, he had accused them of being thieves and spies, and now he is finally going to reveal who he really is to them. Chapter 45 says, Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried, Have everyone go out from me. So there was no man with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and he says to his brothers, I am Joseph. This was 17 years after they'd sold him into slavery. And his brothers were terrified, probably thinking maybe Joseph would try to get retribution against them. And he asked them to come closer, and they do. And he says to them that this was all God's doing. He says in verse 5, Do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. And he says there's still, 5 more years of famine. And he says, Go up to the land of Canaan and get my father and your wives and all of our family and have them all come down here. And they're going to be down here and ride out the famine, and they'll be safe and they'll be fed down here. And so he sends them back. Now, you got to know that's a tough trip for the brothers to go back up there and say, Guess what? We found Joseph. He's alive after all these years. I mean, they've been living a lie for 17 years. Jacob has been living under deceit for 17 years, and now surely all of this is going to come unraveled. But they go up, and in verse 25, it says, They went up from Egypt and came to the land of Canaan to their father Jacob. And they told him, saying, Joseph is still alive. And indeed he is ruler over all the land of Egypt. Now, you've been experiencing the type of deceit that Jacob has for all these years. And these boys come in and say, Hey, guess what? He's alive after all. In fact, he's not just alive, he's ruling the whole land of Egypt, most powerful country in the world down there. Do you think he believed them initially? I doubt it. I mean, it said, in fact, that he was stunned and he did not believe. And when they told him all the words of Joseph that he had spoken to, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry, the spirit of their father revived. You know, it had to be in some ways a bittersweet revival. Yes, he's thrilled to learn that Joseph is still alive. But then suddenly it becomes apparent, not only is Joseph alive, but I've been lied to. And I've been deceived for all these years.